Hi, my name is Randy Kojima, and I'm going to be introducing you to the ICD 16.5 scleral lens, or ICD for irregular corneal design. This lens was developed between colleagues across 3 countries and 2 continents in partnership with Paragon Vision Sciences worldwide. The ICD employs the HDS 100 material as it's been proven over many years to be an exceptional RGP material. The ICD was developed because there are some eyes that we simply cannot fit with corneal GP lenses. Many of our post-surgical, our penetrating keratoplasties, our diseased eyes have difficulty being adequately fit with a corneal GP lenses. Often centration, physiological response, and comfort are a real issue with the fitting of corneal GPs on some of these highly asymmetrical eyes. And that's where a scleral lens is really beneficial. By landing the lens on the sclera, on the more symmetrical shape, peripheral of the cornea, we're able to vault completely the asymmetrical surface of the cornea and land the lens effectively on the symmetrical sclera. And that's the reason for the development of the ICD. Now, part of the challenge that we've faced in the past with scleral lenses is inappropriate limbal or peripheral corneal clearance. And what I mean by that is often lenses are either bearing in the periphery, creating staining, or they're inappropriately vaulting, creating bubbles that cause dryness over time. So one of the challenges that the designers faced in developing the ICD was how could we best align to the surface and create the appropriate vaulting through that peripheral corneal and limbal zone. Another challenge faced with scleral lens designers is landing on this boggy conjunctiva. The conj allows the lens to sink in by quite a degree. Studies have shown in the neighborhood of 50 to 250 microns of settling can occur with a scleral lens into the conjunctiva. So designing a lens that appropriately aligns to this zone is a challenge that all scleral lens manufacturers have faced. One helpful thing to understand how we best align to the surface is to understand the shape out there. And in this image, it's really clear that the shape of the eye throughout the peripheral cornea, the limbus, and the sclera is not curved like it is in the cornea. When we look at the corneal area, we can see that this part of the eye anatomy definitely shows curve. But as we reach the peripheral cornea and the limbus and into the sclera, we see this very straight line or tangent shape. And clearly we need a different approach when landing on a surface that's tangent as opposed to landing on a surface that's curved. And this is part of what makes the ICD unique. Another thing that's helpful is to understand not just that the eye surface is tangent, but how is the surface shaped throughout 360 degrees of the sclera. And this study conducted at Pacific University looked at the angles around the clock at the 15 millimeter chord, that's your inner circle here, and the 20 millimeter chord, your outer circle here. And what we're looking at is in this inner ring, the 15 millimeter chord or 15 millimeter diameter, the eye has about 1.7 degrees of differential around the clock. At the 20 millimeter chord, the eye shows 6.6 degrees of differential around the clock. So what does that mean? That means that a lens that lands near to 15 millimeters can be symmetrical for most eyes. If you land a symmetrical lens near the 20 millimeter chord or 20 millimeters out on the sclera, then it's likely that you need a more asymmetrical lens design or a toric type lens design. And that's obvious from these graphs where you can see the 10 to 15 millimeter cord shows good symmetry of the angles around the clock. They're very tight. The angles are very close together. However, as we go to the 15 to 20 millimeter cord, you see more asymmetry as we move around the eye surface circumferentially. The ICD was developed to land near this 15 millimeter cord where the eye surface is quite symmetrical. So for the majority of eyes, the symmetrical ICD lens that lands at 15 millimeters should fit appropriately around the clock for the majority of eyes that you might face. And this is the pattern of an optimal ICD lens with complete vaulting through the cornea, vaulting through the peripheral cornea and limbus, and landing on the sclera, putting all its weight and pressure on the sclera to center that lens and vaulting the tissue in the center to create a healthy physiological response. But let's review each section of the lens so we can understand what we're looking for with each fit. The ICD has three principal zones: the central clearance zone, the limbal clearance zone, and the scleral landing zone, and that makes up its 16.5 millimeter diameter. Let's start with the central clearance zone. What are we looking at when we look at the central clearance zone of the ICD? Specifically, we want to see the lens utterly clearing corneal tissue. In fact, we want that lens to vault so much that we will have a difficult time making out the pupil. The amount of fluid and fluorescein behind that lens is so dense that the pupil is difficult to make out. And most importantly, we see no areas of any corneal bearing. And that's the first thing that you want to look at when you drop on ICD diagnostic or a custom order lens, that it completely clears central corneal tissue. The next zone in the lens is the limbal clearance zone, and that's exactly what we want to see, is complete clearance throughout the limbus and in fact into the peripheral cornea as well. In white light, you can see the fluorescein molecules in this yellowish color throughout the central clearance zone. That same vaulting appears to go through the peripheral cornea, past the limbus, and right onto the sclera. So there's bleed through of the fluorescein molecules right past the cornea, past the limbus, and onto the sclera. So this ICD lens should land with all its weight and pressure beyond that limbal clearance zone. So the first two things that we want to see are central clearance zone. We want to clear the corneal tissue. The limbal clearance zone, we want to clear the limbal area of the eye anatomy. The next zone in the lens is that scleral landing zone that we talked about earlier. And what we're looking for here, again in white light, is that the fluorescein molecules appear to bleed through past the cornea, past the limbus, and onto the sclera, and then our ICD lens lands out toward the periphery where you see the white. So the lens is landed with all its weight and pressure out on the sclera here. And you'll notice that white where we've pushed the fluorescein molecules out and allowed our lens to land and sink into that boggy conge. Now you can fit the ICD by keratometer or corneal topographer. You don't need expensive equipment to fit the ICD lens. A keratometer is often enough. If you have a corneal topographer, it just may make it easier. So let's look at how we might start with the initial fitting. If you have a keratometer that really measures 3 millimeters of the central cornea, it may not be the best tool for determining the proper scleral lens that lands at 16 or that fits at a 16.5 millimeter diameter and lands at 15 millimeters out. So with your keratometer, really the best way to go is to look at the condition that you're fitting. If you have an utterly normal eye with ocular surface disease, then you want to start with the 4200 SAG lens. Each ICD is measured in terms of its depth at the 15 millimeter chord. So for normal eyes, a 4200 is going to fit quite adequately. If you have a keratoconic patient, then you may want to look at the 4500 micron lens as a starting point. So going up to a higher depth from 4200 to 4500, because the keratoconic eye would have much more depth than the normal eye. If you had a corneal transplant patient, often those proud grafts require very high sagittal depth lenses. This is where you would want to use a 4800 micron as your starting point. And only in extreme cases of keratoglobus or very bulging corneal transplants would you use the very high depth 51, 53, or 5600 micron lens. Now this is a good example. Notice toward the right-hand side that each ICD diagnostic lens has incremental steps of 100 microns. From 3900 to 4900, each lens is 100 microns separated from the next. It's only past 4900 that the jumps become a little higher, from 49 to 51, 51 to 53, and 53 to 56. The extreme depth lenses are used very infrequently. It's most common to use lenses of sags between 4200 and 4500 on most eyes. Once you've selected your initial lens, then you can put it on eye. If you have a corneal topographer that measures sagittal depth, then you may have a step more accurate than using purely the keratometer and the type of condition that you're facing. Take your corneal topography map, in this case a pellucid marginal degeneration patient, and you pull up the window that allows you to measure the sagittal depth of this eye. You first set your chord at 10 millimeters, and then you look for the sagittal depth of the eye at the 10 millimeter chord. In this case, we measure the eye depth, the corneal depth, to a diameter of 10 millimeters as 1800 microns. Another way of thinking of this is, how high is the mountain? If we think of the eye as a mountain and we are going to fit our scleral lens over this mountain, what is the height that we need to clear? And in this case, the corneal depth is 1800 microns. Now we're going to do a simple calculation next. We take our corneal sag from our topographer of 1800 microns. We're going to add our scleral sag factor, which is the average depth of the eye from 10 millimeters to 15 millimeters. And then we're going to add in the apical clearance. Summing the three of these together, 1800 plus your 2000 plus your 400, gives you a depth required of lens of 4200. So we're going to pull out of our ICD fitting diagnostic set the 4200 micron lens. That's a lens that should have 400 microns of apical clearance. When we look at the fitting set again, we can see that the 4200 is here toward the flatter end of the set, which is often what we see with pellucid marginal degeneration patients. If we had an ectatic cone, a keratoconic patient, we might expect to see a calculation much higher in sagittal depth. So again, note that the diagnostic set goes from 3900 to 4900 in 100 micron increments. So from the flattest lens, as you go to the next higher lens, you've just added 100 microns in sagittal depth at the apex. Also note that the powers correspond with +1 as the 3900. Then as you go to the next higher depth lens, the 4000, you go to a plano. A 41 is -1, a 42 is -2, 43 is -3, and so on. So it would be easy if you mix up lenses on a patient without a radioscope to determine which trial is which. Simply put the lens on the lensometer and you can tell which is your correct trial ICD lens. Now the next step is, once we've chosen our diagnostic lens, let's place it on eye. And the way to do this is to have the patient parallel to the surface of the counter or the surface of the floor so that you can bring the lens straight up with the bowl filled with both preservative-free saline and the fluorescein. The fluorescein will be difficult to get underneath the lens once the lens is on eye. So it's important to insert the lens with the fluorescein there. And don't forget that you want to use preservative-free saline. If you put any preservatives in behind your scleral lenses, that can create a significant reaction by the corneal surface, usually in the form of a keratitis. So make sure that your patients always insert with preservative-free saline. Now the next step is once the lens goes on eye, make sure that you've inserted the lens without a bubble. If that lens goes on without a bubble, you need to take it off and reapply it without that bubble in behind. It's important that the lens clears the corneal tissue but without any bubbles there. Now in the upper right hand side, this is the type of fit that we want to see when we drop the lens on eye. We want a lens that utterly clears corneal tissue, we want to see no bubbles, and we want to have a difficult time making out the pupil. The image in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see a lens that has bearing on the corneal surface. You can see exactly where the cone is, that high point where we have corneal bearing. If that lens goes on eye and has central touch in the central clearance zone, you know you need to go back to the fitting set and add more depth. If that lens has bearing, it would be likely you need at least 300 microns more sagittal depth. So if you put on a 4200 micron lens and it has central corneal touch, then put on the next lens as a 4500 lens. The lens in the image in the lower, excuse me, the lower lower right hand side is appropriately clearing the corneal tissue. However, it's easy to make out the pupil margin. So this patient may have inadequate clearance after that lens settles. In this case, it might be advisable to put on a higher sagittal depth lens and create more of a fluid layer between lens and cornea. Now, how do we determine the apical clearance of these lenses? If we're looking for a lens that has so much volume of fluid and fluorescein that we can't make out the pupil, how do we say what is exactly 400 microns? And the way to do that is to pull up your optical section or your parallel pipette. What you want to do is measure the thickness of the lens, which is a known 300 microns or 0.3 millimeters thick. Compare that known 300 microns to the thickness of posterior tear film fluid. In this case, we would guesstimate at the center the fluid thickness is slightly under 300 microns. We would like the lens to go on eye with approximately 300 to 400 microns of fluid. So this might just be an inadequate amount of fluid. We could also use the thickness of the cornea to determine the thickness of the posterior fluid, although with patients with corneal thinning disorders and thinner corneal tissue, it may not be the best reference point. However, if we presume that this eye is approximately 500 to 600 microns thick, then we could say that our fluid thickness appears to be about half the thickness of corneal tissue, or maybe slightly less than half. So it's an excellent way of guesstimating the thickness of the fluid between your ICD lens and the surface of the eye. And again, we're looking for a starting point of approximately 400 microns. Why so much fluid between the lens and cornea? Because we know from numerous studies, both in North America and in Australia, that scleral lenses settle by approximately 50 to 250 microns. So if you don't have enough fluid between lens and cornea, then that lens may settle into the conge and actually land on the surface of corneal tissue, which we're trying to avoid. Now, when you look at the corneal topography, the axial map in the upper left-hand side would indicate that the steepest point on the eye surface is this red. Is that the highest point? When we drop on the ICD lens, we see it vaulting through this zone. And in fact, the highest point on this cornea appears to be this arcuate area around here. And the best way to determine what is the highest point on the eye surface is to use your corneal topographer and pull up the elevation display. The upper right image shows you your elevation map, and red is where the eye surface is high. Blue is where the eye surface is low. So the axial map tells you where the eye is curved, but it doesn't tell you where the eye is curved up as an elevation or down as a depression. This red could be the starting point of a volcano where you're hitting a very high point, or it could be the edge of the cliff as you fall into the valley. So use your elevation map to show you where is the eye surface very high. And the question would be, are we clearing the peripheral cornea and limbus in our peripheral or our limbal clearance zone? Do we need to adjust this zone? And an excellent way to determine if you have inadequate clearance in the limbal clearance zone is to have the patient look in the opposite direction of the bearing. In this case, the patient is showing you arcuate bearing of the lens, or maybe not bearing, it could be thinning of the fluorescein pattern, where we actually are still vaulting, but the fluorescein and fluid is thin enough that it appears like bearing. So should we be concerned? And what we would do is have the patient look down. And we're going to look opposite to that bearing and see if the lens will clear that zone as it comes up slightly. We'll have the patient look nasal and temporal to make sure it completely vaults through that peripheral cornea and limbus. My colleague Pat Caroline at Pacific University uses a rule of if there is less than 180 degrees of thinning throughout the peripheral cornea and limbus, he doesn't modify it. If that thinning is greater than 180 degrees, if you had 360 degrees of this thinning or possible bearing, then you would adjust that limbal clearance zone depth. So this is a good example where the apical clearance is probably adequate. It's difficult to make out the pupil, so our apical clearance is good. We don't need to change the sagittal depth of this lens, but possibly we need to change the limbal clearance zone of this lens. And with this bearing being less than 180 degrees, you would presume you do not need modification. If you wanted to be sure, have the patient look in the opposite direction of the bearing. In this case, have the patient look down. As that lens comes up slightly, you notice it vaults completely through this zone. So this lens does not need modification to the custom order. Now, this is another example where you see a lens with bearing throughout the nasal aspect and possibly into the superior cornea. That bearing appears more arcuate to a small area from maybe 12 o'clock, maybe 11 o'clock around to 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock. So less than 180 degrees of bearing. But if we're not sure, we'll ask the patient to look down and out. And the idea is, as that lens moves, or pardon me, as the patient looks in this direction and the lens moves in the opposite direction, do you see it vault through this zone? If there was inadequate vaulting, if that lens appeared to have bearing, or if you remove the lens after a certain number of hours wear and you saw any kind of staining or disruption of epithelium, then we may want to adjust that limbal clearance zone. What does that mean exactly? To change the limbal clearance zone is to modify the vaulting that exists throughout this area. So where you can see the lighter density of molecules, that's clear corneal tissue. In this OCT image, you can see the darker white density. This is your sclera, and in between is your limbus. And this ICD lens shows inadequate clearance or inadequate vaulting. There is inadequate amount of fluid between lens and eye surface. So in this case, we would want to modify that limbal clearance zone. What does that mean exactly? By increasing the depth of the limbal clearance zone, by changing the angle of the tangent that exists here, you create more vaulting on the surface of the eye. And that's what we do when we change the limbal clearance zone. We simply increase this angle so that it creates more vaulting through that peripheral cornea, limbus, and initial part of the sclera. Adjusting limbal clearance zone is probably one of the more frequent adjustments that you're going to make. There are two adjustments that you commonly make, adjusting limbal clearance zone and the amount of edge lift, the scleral landing zone. And we'll go through that as well. Now the last zone in the lens is the scleral landing zone. And what we're looking for is a lens that lands with 100% of its weight and pressure out on the sclera. We want the lens to spread its bearing throughout the conjunctiva where it lands and create a soft, distributed amount of pressure. Another thing that we're looking for, and the more obvious sign that we can see with slit lamp evaluation, is to look at the vessels, both the small and large capillaries. Do they appear to run past the edge of the lens and in their normal pattern toward the cornea? Is there any restriction of any of these vessels? That's what we're looking for when we evaluate the ICD lens with the slit lamp. Any restriction of these vessels, and we would want to modify the edge of that lens. In this case, we can see a beautiful landing of our ICD throughout its scleral landing zone, where each vessel appears to take its normal course right past the edge of the lens. Compare that to this landing of the lens, where there's complete restriction of the vessels, or near complete restriction of the vessels, throughout the edge of the lens. And this is a case where you would want to adjust your scleral landing zone to create more edge lift, to land that lens softly so it allows normal vessel flow past the edge of the lens. And to do that, what you do is you take your standard ICD edge and you create an increased edge lift. That tells the lab to order the lens and manufacture the lens with the tip coming up higher on the surface so that it doesn't sink in and restrict that vessel flow. It is common, as I said, to require modification to the scleral landing zone, but typically a one-step adjustment resolves any form of blanching that you might have. It's uncommon to need 2 or 3-step adjustments to your scleral landing zone. We have yet to see an ICD lens that needs a steeper edge or less edge lift. However, that may be possible, in which case you can custom order that from the lab. Modifications to the scleral landing zone are not made within the diagnostic set. Similarly, modifications to the limbal clearance zone are not made within the diagnostic set. And what I mean by that is you use the diagnostic lens to determine if you have the right sagittal depth. If you have inadequate limbal clearance or an inadequate landing of the scleral landing zone, you simply call your ICD consultant, tell them the sagittal depth of lens that was optimal, and note the modification required to the limbal clearance zone, or consult with your technical advisor at the lab and they'll tell you what needs to be done to most appropriately design the lens. Now the last thing you need to do is simply your standard spherical over-refraction over the lens. And once you have this information, you're ready to order your ICD from your consultant at the lab or customer service at your ICD distributing lab. Now, a couple considerations that we need to make when fitting scleral lenses in general, and the ICD no different, is to allow for 60 minutes of settling. Why 60 minutes? That lens needs to settle into the conj. We need to see how much does it settle. Does it settle so much that it creates inadequate clearance of corneal tissue or of an ectatic condition? We also want to look for this blanching that might be seen after that lens settles, after that edge sinks into the conj. So it's important to put the lens on eye, make sure it clears corneal tissue. If it does, then let the patient sit for 60 minutes or have the patient walk around for a certain amount of time past 60 minutes. And that's important, that we must have 60 minutes of lens settling before we evaluate the limbal clearance zone, the scleral landing zone, and even the central clearance zone to see if it's inadequately cleared after the lens is settled. Make sure that you use preservative-free saline and you've rinsed off any conditioning solution that the lens was stored in prior to insertion. We don't want any solution toxicity building up for the patient. It's also important to understand that scleral lenses, sealed scleral lenses that land at 14, 15, 16 millimeters or more, often trap the fluid in between the lens and the eye. So as that lens sinks into the boggy conj, it's going to trap that preservative-free fluid there. And over time, for a small percentage of patients, that fluid will become milky. The reason for this is not clearly understood at this point. However, we do know that a certain percentage of patients seem to get a more mucus-like appearance of their fluid between lens and cornea, and that lens needs to be removed when that fluid becomes milky so the patient can achieve clear, crisp, sharp vision again. A study done by John Mountford in Australia indicated that 40% of patients in the first 30 days of wear needed to remove their scleral lens at some point during the day to refresh the fluid. However, only 10% of patients after 30 days needed to remove their lenses to refresh the fluid. So this is something that we need to prepare ourselves for with scleral lenses. The upside of scleral lenses is that almost all patients will report that these lenses have the comfort of soft lenses. And in fact, that's what we see them report on comfort scales. Patients that first wear a scleral lens will report an 8 out of 10 on a comfort scale, similar to soft lens patients who report first-time wearers would say that their soft lens is an 8 on a 10 scale, where 1 would be very uncomfortable, 10 would be very comfortable. So with scleral lenses, we're able to achieve the comfort of soft lenses because the lenses don't move. But a side that we need to be aware of is that they trap the fluid in there. So don't be surprised if your patients need to refresh that fluid at some point during the day. And what we're looking for is after that lens settles, we want to make sure that that lens doesn't blanch the scleral area. Have we sunk that lens into the conj so much that we've sealed off the vessels? So that's something to keep your eye on, and if the patient notices any red, angry eyes, of course they should report to you immediately. So very simple and straightforward fitting with the ICD 16.5. Your first thought is, what is the central clearance zone clearance? Do we have vaulting of that lens throughout the cornea? The next thing is to determine, do we have adequate vaulting of approximately 400 microns on insertion, because we know the lens will sink by 50 to 250 microns. So we want enough fluid after settling. In this case, you can see our 300 microns of lens thickness here, with our anterior surface fluid, lens 300 microns, and the posterior thickness of fluid appears to be at least double that of the ICD lens at 300 microns. In this case, if this is the trial lens you've put on eye, you don't have to put on another trial lens. You can simply call up the lab and tell them that you want to order a lens with 200 or 300 microns less sagittal depth, and they can calculate the appropriate lens for you. However, if you have a lens that hits the cornea that has inadequate vaulting, you must put on another trial lens. So if the lens clears by an excessive amount, you can simply over-refract and call the lens and tell them how much fluid is between lens and cornea. You will not need to put on another lens. If the lens has apical corneal touch or any central corneal touch, you need to put on another diagnostic lens to make sure that your ICD lens is going to appropriately clear after settling and protect that corneal tissue. The next zone in the lens, as a reminder, is that limbal clearance zone, and what we're looking for is that bleed through of fluorescein in white light. We want that lens to show the fluorescein molecules running past the peripheral cornea, past the limbus, and onto the sclera, and then placing all its weight and pressure on that last zone in the lens, the scleral landing zone. So we expect to see the fluorescein molecules run past the cornea, past the limbus, onto the sclera, and then get squeezed out as the ICD lens lands with all its weight and pressure on the sclera. And then lastly, we're looking for good alignment of that edge with the conjunctival tissue. Do we see the fluorescein, do we see the vessels running past the edge of the lens, taking their normal path? Is there any blanching whatsoever? Now, to remove the lens, a helpful technique is to press with your index finger on the lower lid below the lens and create a gap between the lens and the eye surface. And this will allow a bubble to squeeze in underneath. Once that bubble's in there, you've broken the surface tension. That lens will easily pop out with the scissor technique or a DMV suction cup. The bubble is not necessary to remove the lens, but it does make it much easier to pop off that lens because you've broken all the surface tension, all the hydraulic force that exists with that trapped fluid between lens and cornea. Now, to sum up what makes the ICD different from other scleral lenses is it has three very simple zones to consider, and it's a 14 lens diagnostic set. For most eyes, you could probably get away with only 11 lenses. The highest sagittal depth lenses are for very unusual globic or very proud bulging grafts that we see very infrequently. So in fact, most eyes can be fit with a very small number of trial lenses. A unique design characteristic of the ICD is it was designed with tangents in the periphery. Why tangent surfaces? Tangents because the eye surface is tangent. It's a straight line, flat tangent shape. So therefore the ICD was developed using a number of tangents in the periphery to best vault and align through the peripheral cornea, limbus, and then create the landing on the sclera that's optimal. You'll find the ICD lens very forgiving throughout that limbal clearance zone, that peripheral corneal zone, and also in the scleral landing zone. And it's the use of tangents that make this lens unique. Coupled with the HDS 100 material, we have a very stable platform for most eyes that might walk through the door. I'd like to thank you for your time and in listening to this ICD training and orientation video. If you require additional information, please go to the ICD website to find an authorized ICD distributor in your neighborhood. Lastly, if you would like to contact Paragon Vision Sciences for more information, they can be reached at 1-800-528-8279.